I'm sorry, can you repeat that? I asked, blinking like I didn't just hear my entire 22-year career get doused in gasoline and lit with a smug little matchstick smile. Bryce didn't even look up from his tablet. Your numbers are unusual, he said, dragging out the word like it had dirt under its nails. Could be an anomaly, maybe a back-end patch someone else pushed. Either way, bonus eligibility requires sustainable metrics, collective synergy, not solo outliers. There it was. The sentence that made my ears ring and my throat close up like a bad allergic reaction. 47% reduction in system delays, error rates down to 2.1%, 22 years of obsessive weekends, missed family dinners, and enough coffee to stop a horse's heart. And this corporate buzzword specialist just erased me with a phrase he read in an airport business magazine. My name is Gerald Armstrong. I'm 49 years old, and I've been building computer systems since before this kid learned to balance a checkbook. I've got a mortgage with 8 years left, a daughter finishing college next year, and I'd been counting on this bonus to help with her tuition bills. Across the table, a few of the other executives looked down at their hands, their coffees, anywhere but at me. One cleared his throat and said something about team alignment. I didn't hear it. I was too busy watching 2 decades of loyalty walk out the door. I stood up slowly, took off my badge, clean and deliberate, and set it down on the table like a poker chip. No raised voice, no snarky comeback, just a quiet end to a very loud betrayal. The room was still silent when I walked out, not because I'd made a scene, but because I hadn't, and somehow that carried more weight than any outburst could have. Let me back up and tell you what led to this moment. The computer system I'd spent my career maintaining was like an old house that had been added onto by 3 generations of owners. When I arrived in 2003, it was already a patchwork of different technologies held together by digital duct tape and prayers. No documentation, no backup plans, just chaos and a bunch of spreadsheet files with names like important, don't delete this one. So I rebuilt it piece by piece, the way you'd restore a classic car. Nights, weekends, holidays, the kind of dedication that made my wife shake her head and ask if I loved that computer more than my family. I wasn't chasing recognition, I just couldn't sleep, knowing that any day, a simple glitch could shut down our billing system and cost the company millions. I'd seen those disasters before. In my early days, I watched entire departments panic when systems crashed, scrambling to process customer orders by hand while executives screamed about lost revenue. I made sure that wouldn't happen on my watch. But Bryce Wellington didn't see any of that. Bryce saw spreadsheets, cost centers, and his own reflection in video conference calls. He was hired 3 months ago, fresh from some consulting firm where disruption meant tearing apart everything that actually worked and replacing it with trendy solutions that sounded good in PowerPoint presentations. First thing he did was eliminate the senior team leaders, renamed our development groups to impact clusters, and started every meeting with a slide that said, "Let's go hunting," like he was preparing for some kind of corporate warfare instead of running a technology department. When I presented my quarterly report, complete with before and after response times, system reliability metrics, and a breakdown of how my improvements had prevented an estimated $2.3 million in downtime costs, he squinted like he was trying to read hieroglyphics. "Feels a little isolated," he muttered. "Did you run this through our new alignment protocol?" "What protocol?" I asked. He smiled that practiced MBA smile. Exactly. Right then I knew. The bonus wasn't coming. The recognition never would. The moment he saw my name attached to those successful metrics, his brain filed me under threat. Here was a system that worked too well, managed by a guy who didn't need his permission to fix problems. And at 49, with gray hair and a methodical approach that predated his favorite buzzwords, I represented everything his modern management style was supposed to replace. So, yeah, I handed over that badge. No tantrum, no dramatic speech, just quiet professionalism. Because what Bryce didn't realize, what none of them had bothered to ask, was that the system wasn't some team effort cobbled together by committee meetings and collaboration software. It was mine. Built from experience, from instinct, from knowledge earned through every midnight crisis and early morning emergency fix. And more importantly, it existed primarily in my head, not in fancy documentation systems, not in training manuals that Bryce could hand to the next guy, but In the mental map I'd developed over 22 years of keeping that digital house standing. When I walked out that door, I didn't just quit a job. I took the architectural blueprints with me. And I had a pretty good idea what was going to happen once they tried to renovate without knowing where the load-bearing walls were located. The drive home gave me time to think about what I'd just walked away from. 22 years of building something that actually mattered, reduced to a line item that some consultant could dismiss with corporate jargon. But as I sat in my driveway, rain streaking down the windshield, I realized something. They hadn't just lost an employee. They'd lost the one person who understood how their entire operation actually functioned. And in about 72 hours, they were going to find that out the hard way. By the time I pulled into my driveway that evening, word had already started spreading through the office grapevine. Gerald walked out. No notice, no handoff, no goodbye lunch, not even a LinkedIn update. Just whispers echoing through email chains and cautious text messages that hit my phone like digital shoulder taps. I sat in the car for a good 10 minutes, watching the rain carve slow rivers down the windshield. My neighbor's dog was barking at something in the darkness, probably a raccoon getting into the garbage again. Seemed fitting somehow. Inside, the house felt different, quieter. My laptop was still open on the kitchen table from the night before, showing a half-finished system configuration file that would never get deployed now. Sarah, my wife, was already asleep upstairs. She had an early shift at the hospital tomorrow, and I hadn't had the heart to call and tell her what happened. How do you explain that 22 years of dedicated service just got brushed aside by someone who probably couldn't restart a router without calling tech support? The first text came from Luis Rodriguez, one of the back-end programmers I'd worked with on countless weekend deployments over the years. Heard what happened. That's completely unfair, man. Sorry. 2 minutes later, another one. Wait, did you really not leave any documentation behind? Then Chloe Winters from our quality assurance team. Bryce told everyone you quit because you couldn't adapt to modern workflows. I told him that was garbage for the record. Adapt. Such a convenient word. It gets thrown around when people want to blame you for not pretending to be stupid. But the message that hit hardest came from Melanie Brooks, the only other person who regularly stayed past midnight when we had critical system updates to deploy. Her text was simple. You built that entire infrastructure from the ground up. They have no idea what they just lost. I stared at that message for a long time. Not because it made me feel vindicated, but because it reminded me exactly why this hurt so much. I hadn't just maintained a computer system for 22 years. I had become that system. Every automated process, every data connection, every security protocol, it all traced back to decisions I'd made, problems I'd solved, and Band-Aid fixes that had gradually evolved into permanent solutions. The company's billing system processed $50 million in transactions every month. Their customer database handled inquiries for 200,000 active accounts. Their inventory management tracked parts and services across 8 regional offices, all of it running smoothly because I'd spent 2 decades learning exactly how each piece connected to every other piece. And now I had to walk away from it. So I did what any professional does when facing forced retirement from their life's work. I started cleaning up my digital footprint. Personal files first, tax documents, family photos, the script I'd written to automatically back up my home computer. Nothing that belonged to the company, just the scattered pieces of a career that had taken over most of my waking hours for the past 2 decades. I shut down my remote access connections, deleted my saved passwords, and revoked the administrative privileges I'd accumulated over the years. Standard procedure for someone leaving. The company, though, I doubted anyone had thought to create a checklist for my specific situation. But then I hesitated at one particular file, an old monitoring script I'd written during my 2nd month on the job, back when the system crashed so frequently that we kept a sleeping bag in the server room. It wasn't fancy, just a simple program that checked on critical services every few minutes and logged the results in a secure directory that only I knew about. We used to call it Watchdog because it would alert us whenever something started acting strange. Over the years, it had evolved into something more sophisticated, with automatic responses to common problems and built-in safeguards to prevent the kind of cascading failures that could bring down the entire network. I opened the log file and scrolled through months of routine entries. System normal, 2025. 10, 28 is now 23 parent 15. Database connection, stable, 2025, 10:98, Orarons 23 or 45. All services responding. 2025, 10:28, Yaran 94:15. Page after page of digital proof that everything was running exactly as it should. Then, at the bottom, I noticed something I'd forgotten about. A single line in plain text. Authentication expired. Failsafe mode pending activation. I hadn't written that recently. It was part of an old test routine I'd implemented years ago, back when I was still paranoid about unauthorized access to critical systems. A simple security measure. If the primary system administrator's credentials went unused for more than 72 hours, certain automated processes would shift into a protective mode, requiring manual authorization for any major changes. It seemed like harmless redundancy at the time, just another layer of security in case something happened to me. Heart attack, car accident, sudden illness, the kinds of risks that become more real when you hit your late 40s and realize you're not invincible anymore. I closed the terminal window without changing anything. Let the security protocols do what they were designed to do. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Not because I was happy about losing my job, but because for the first time in years, I wasn't carrying the weight of keeping that entire digital infrastructure running. Let Bryce Wellington figure out what collaborative leadership meant when the collaboration involved systems that had been running on autopilot for so long that people had forgotten they needed active management. Monday morning, I didn't set an alarm. I made coffee at a reasonable hour, read the newspaper without checking my phone every 5 minutes for system alerts, and started browsing job listings for senior technical positions. Remote work was more common now, and my experience with large-scale system management was still valuable, even if my current employer couldn't see it. Meanwhile, 15 miles away in a corporate office building, Bryce Wellington was about to discover the difference between managing a team and actually understanding what that team had been. Doing all along, Bryce Wellington strutted into Monday morning's team meeting like he'd just closed a Fortune 500 merger over breakfast. He clapped his hands together with the enthusiasm of someone who had never actually fixed a broken system at 3 a.m. All right, team, fresh week, fresh opportunities. Gerald's departure opened up some interesting possibilities for restructuring our workflow. That's what we're here for, right? To innovate and scale. He gestured toward the whiteboard like a general planning an invasion. Jared Phillips, Stephen Garcia, you two are going to spearhead the transition. I want a complete mapping of his infrastructure by Wednesday. Jared and Stephen exchanged glances. Both were bright kids, recent computer science graduates with impressive academic credentials and exactly zero experience managing systems that processed real money for real customers. I'd worked with them on a few smaller projects, and they had potential, but asking them to reverse engineer 22 years of institutional knowledge was like handing someone a recipe written in a foreign language and expecting a 5-star meal. They spent the morning in Conference Room B, surrounded by whiteboards, sticky notes, and enough energy drinks to power a small aircraft. The company's technical documentation, such as it was, consisted of 2 main folders in our shared drive: System Overview and Legacy Notes. The overview contained mostly organizational charts and hardware purchase orders. The legacy notes were a collection of my troubleshooting comments from various emergencies over the years. Where's the actual system architecture? Stephen asked, scrolling through files with names like server to use config, final, v3, use this one. I thought it would be in the database documentation, Jared replied, opening what appeared to be a comprehensive technical manual. It contained 47 pages of detailed specifications for hardware that had been replaced 6 years ago. They tried following my naming conventions for the automated processes, which was their first mistake. Over 2 decades, I'd developed a personal shorthand that made perfect sense to me, but probably looked like cryptic poetry to anyone else. Database connections named things like Nightcrawler, Sentry Duty, and Last Resort. Backup procedures called Plan B, Electric Boogaloo, and Hail Mary, Full of Grace. The comments embedded in the code weren't much help either. Things like Ichbaoid Boys and Eeyore. Don't touch this unless you enjoy 4 a.m. phone calls and Ispaor so Restov. Yes, if this breaks, the billing team will sacrifice you to their spreadsheet gods. By noon, Jared looked like someone had explained quantum physics using interpretive dance. None of this follows standard documentation practices, he whispered to Stephen. It's like he designed everything to make sense only to him. That was exactly what I'd done, of course. Not out of malice, but out of necessity. When you're the only person responsible for keeping a complex system running, and when management changes every few years but expects everything to keep working seamlessly, you develop your own methods, you create backup systems for your backup systems, and you name things in ways that help you remember what they do when you're troubleshooting at midnight on a Sunday. Bryce checked in on their progress around 2 p.m., radiating the kind of confidence that comes from never having personally experienced a catastrophic system failure. How's the knowledge transfer going? Stephen rotated his laptop screen to show a network diagram that looked like abstract art. We've identified what we think are the main data pathways, but the authentication system seems to be unconventional. He overcomplicated everything, Bryce said with a dismissive wave. Classic old-school approach. We'll rebuild it properly. Cleaner, more efficient, using modern frameworks. Should take maybe 2 weeks tops. They nodded because what else could they do when the person signing their paychecks was absolutely certain that 2 decades of careful system development could be replicated in a standard project sprint. But while they were drawing diagrams and making plans, something else was happening in the background. That old monitoring script I'd mentioned, the one we called Watchdog, wasn't just watching anymore. It was waiting. Deep in its programming was a calendar function tied to administrative access patterns. Specifically, a security protocol that activated 72 hours after the primary system architect's credentials went unused. It wasn't designed to cause problems, just the opposite. It was meant to prevent unauthorized changes to critical systems during periods when the person most qualified to handle emergencies wasn't available. Wednesday afternoon, at exactly 3:47 p.m., the waiting period expired. Several administrative access tokens that had been marked as Gerald Armstrong primary were automatically flagged as dormant. Security permissions on the main database were quietly updated. A notification was sent to the system monitoring channel, but it appeared as a routine security update rather than an alarm. If you knew what to look for, you'd see a single line in the activity log. Primary administrator access expired. Restricted mode activated, but nobody was looking at those logs. Jared and Stephen were too busy trying to understand why the backup system seemed to be designed like a Russian nesting doll, with each layer requiring different credentials that apparently only I had known. Bryce was in back-to-back meetings, explaining to senior management how his modernization initiative was going to streamline operations and reduce technical debt. None of them noticed that the system had just locked them out of its most critical functions. The first sign of trouble came at 11:15 a.m. on Thursday. Not a dramatic crash or a system-wide alarm, just a small discrepancy in the daily financial reconciliation report. The automated process that balanced customer payments against service deliveries had paused. Not failed exactly, just stopped in the middle of its routine and waited for manual authorization that wasn't coming. Finance noticed it first. Patricia Coleman from accounting called the IT help desk to report that vendor payments from the previous day weren't showing up in the settlement reports. Everything looks normal on our end, but the numbers aren't adding up. Can someone check the billing interface? Jared took the call. He spent an hour tracing through what he thought was the payment processing system, following data connections through a maze of interconnected programs that seemed designed by someone who had never heard of linear thinking. Every time he thought he'd found the source of the problem, the trail led to another subsystem that required different access permissions. Finally, he called Stephen for backup. "I think I found the billing module," Jared said, "but it's asking for authentication credentials that aren't in any of our documentation." "What kind of credentials?" "Primary architect authorization. Manual override required." Stephen was quiet for a moment. "Gerald's credentials?" "Yeah, but he's gone. His accounts were deactivated Monday night. That's when they realized that their problem wasn't just incomplete documentation. The system had been designed to recognize Gerald Armstrong as its primary caretaker. And now that he was gone, it was refusing to operate without explicit permission from someone it trusted, someone who was no longer there to give it. By Friday morning, what had started as a minor billing hiccup had evolved into a full-scale corporate emergency. The system wasn't just refusing to process new transactions. It was systematically shutting down access to every function that required administrative approval. Customer service couldn't access account histories. The inventory system wouldn't update stock levels. Regional office connections were timing out, and the automated backup processes that I'd spent years perfecting had simply stopped. Not crashed, not corrupted, just politely declined to continue without proper authorization. Bryce Wellington stood in the main conference room at 6:30 a.m., his usual corporate confidence replaced by something closer to panic. His hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and he kept checking his phone like it might magically provide solutions to problems he didn't understand. "Where are we on the recovery plan?" he asked Stephen and Jared, who looked like they hadn't slept in 48 hours. "We've tried everything we can think of," Stephen replied, his voice hoarse. "Every major function is asking for primary architect authorization. We can't even access the backup configurations without Gerald's credentials. Then override it. Use your administrative access. We tried that. The system doesn't recognize our accounts as authorized for critical operations. It's like Gerald built it to only trust him. That's exactly what I had done, of course. Not out of ego, but out of hard-learned experience. I'd seen too many disasters caused by well-meaning, but inexperienced technicians making changes they didn't fully understand. So, I'd designed multiple layers of security that required someone with deep system knowledge to approve any modifications to essential functions. At 7:15 a.m., Michael Davidson, our chief operating officer, walked into the conference room. He was still in his weekend clothes, jeans and a polo shirt, which meant someone had called him at home with news bad enough to interrupt his Saturday morning golf routine. "Explain to me how we lost control of our own computer systems," he said without preamble. Bryce cleared his throat. "We're experiencing some temporary technical difficulties related to Gerald's departure. Nothing we can't handle. The team is working on alternative solutions." "Alternative solutions?" Davidson's voice was dangerously quiet. "We've got $3 million in vendor payments stuck in the system. Our customer database is locked. 8 regional offices can't process new orders. And you're telling me this is because one employee quit?" The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Stephen spoke up. "Sir, we didn't realize how much of the system architecture was dependent on Gerald's specific access credentials. He didn't leave detailed documentation about the security protocols." Davidson turned to Bryce. "You told me he was just a mid-level technician, easily replaceable. That's what I thought." His official title was Senior Systems Engineer. "I had no idea he was—" Bryce trailed off, perhaps finally understanding the magnitude of his mistake. "He was what?" "The only person who really knew how everything worked." Davidson was quiet for a long moment, then pulled out his phone. "What's Gerald Armstrong's personal number?" "They tried calling me, of course. My cell phone rang 17 times over the next 2 hours. I was sitting on my back deck, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper in the crisp autumn air, feeling more relaxed than I had in years. Each call went to voicemail. I didn't answer, not out of spite, but because I'd already moved on. That morning, I'd received 3 separate job offers from companies that had looked at my resume and recognized the value of someone who could design and maintain large-scale systems single-handedly. One offer was from a consulting firm that specialized in helping businesses recover from exactly the kind of crisis my former employer was now experiencing. The irony wasn't lost on me. Meanwhile, back at the office, they were trying increasingly desperate measures. They brought in a team of outside contractors who promised they could bypass any security system. Within 3 hours, those contractors had managed to lock themselves out of even basic functions, triggering additional security protocols that I had built to prevent exactly that kind of unauthorized intrusion. At 2:30 p.m., Davidson made the decision that Bryce had been dreading all day. "We're going to offer him whatever it takes to come back." "Sir, I don't think that's necessary. We just need more time to—" "Bryce." Davidson's voice cut through the air like a blade. "We have 200,000 customers who can't access their accounts. We have vendors threatening to suspend service if they don't get paid by Monday. And we have a board of directors who are going to want someone's head on a platter when they find out about this." The formal offer came via overnight courier, a consulting contract worth more than my annual salary, plus an immediate bonus equal to what I should have received in the first place, plus a formal apology from the board of directors for the miscommunication regarding my contributions to the company. I read it sitting in my kitchen, Sunday morning, Sarah reading over my shoulder as she made breakfast. "Are you going to take it?" she asked. I looked out the window at our yard, at the neighbors walking their dogs, at the life I'd been too busy maintaining other people's computer systems to fully enjoy. "No," I said. "I think it's time for something new." Instead, I wrote a brief response explaining that I was no longer available for consulting work with my former employer, but that I wished them well in resolving their current difficulties. I suggested they contact the original system vendor for assistance with recovery procedures. What I didn't mention was that the original system vendor had gone out of business 8 years ago. Monday morning, I started my new job as senior technology consultant for a firm that helped mid-sized companies modernize their infrastructure. My first assignment was developing disaster recovery plans, comprehensive strategies for what to do when critical personnel leave unexpectedly. I never heard directly how my former company resolved their crisis, but I did notice a news item 6 weeks later announcing that Bryce Wellington had decided to pursue other opportunities. The new IT director they hired turned out to be someone I knew from the industry, a seasoned professional who understood that good systems aren't just about the technology, but about the knowledge and experience of the people who build them. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's simply walking away and letting people discover what they've lost. The system remembered who built it, even when the company forgot. And that, as they say, is how you collapse a system without breaking a single law or touching a single line of code. You just stop being there to hold it together.